A few weeks ago, someone close to me had a small emergency. Nothing dramatic. A two-wheeler that skidded on a wet road, a wrist in a cast, a bill of about 15,000 rupees. What stayed with me was not the accident. It was watching a working salaried adult sit at the kitchen table that night and quietly rearrange the entire month around one bill that, on paper, they could easily afford. The EMI, the school fee, the festival money, all of it shuffled and squeezed to absorb one small shock. Now, I should tell you where I stand because this video ends with an opinion. I think the Indian household today carries far more risk than it lets on, and we have slowly learned to call that normal. But I also think that same household is one of the most resilient things I know, surviving on an ingenuity that would break a spreadsheet. And honestly, the resilience and the risk turn out to be the same story. That is what makes this worth the next few minutes of your time. Because the stakes are not abstract and they are not far away. Almost every headline you have seen this month, the floods in the Northeast, the fuel prices moving, a new tax rule, a cousin quietly laid off, all of it lands on the same kitchen table I just described. We read them as separate news stories. They are not. They are the same story, arriving through different doors. And if you ask why these things hit ordinary Indians so hard, most people will say prices are high, or the government failed, or times are simply tough, something vague and safely out there. But you know what? That is not really the core of it. The real reason is quieter, and it sits inside the house, not outside it. Between the average Indian family and almost any shock, there is very little standing in the way, very little cushion. So here is what we are going to do. First, I want to show you what that cushion actually is and how thin it has quietly become. Then, why a thin cushion is the thing that turns ordinary news into a personal emergency. And finally, the big one, whether this is simply our fate or a thing we can slowly and deliberately fix. Fundamentals first. A buffer is just the gap between you and the bad day. Savings you can actually reach, insurance that pays when it should, a job that is not your only one, people who can lend without shame. Economists have a dull phrase for it, financial resilience. I prefer a simpler test. If your income stopped tomorrow, how many days could your life continue completely unchanged? Hold your number. We will come back to it. Now here is the uncomfortable measurement. By the Reserve Bank's own figures, the net financial savings of Indian households recently fell to around 5% of the economy, by most accounts the lowest in roughly 5 decades. Let me translate that. It does not mean people stopped earning. It means that after the EMIs, after the spending, what the average household actually sets aside and could reach in a crisis has shrunk to about the thinnest it has been in the memory of almost anyone watching this. And it is thin in a very specific way. In survey after survey, a majority of Indian families say they could not cover a sudden expense of even 10,000 rupees without borrowing. For context, 10,000 rupees is a cracked phone, one hospital night, a fridge that dies in the heat of May. It is not a disaster, it is a Tuesday. The buffer has become so thin that an ordinary Tuesday now has to be financed. But that is just the beginning, because a thin cushion would still be survivable if life sent its shocks rarely. It does not. And this is the second thing I really want you to see. How a thin cushion quietly turns the news of the day into your problem specifically. See, when there is no buffer, every outside event becomes an inside emergency. A river floods in the Northeast, and because the home was never insured, a family does not lose a difficult month, it loses a decade of saving. Diesel moves up by 3 rupees, and because the budget carried no slack at all, the vegetable seller and the auto driver and the tiffin service each pass it down the line until it lands on a dinner plate. None of these people did anything wrong. They simply had no shock absorber, so the shock traveled all the way through them. And the shocks are not even the dramatic ones, mostly. The most common shock in an Indian household is not a flood or a layoff. It is a hospital bill. By most estimates, tens of millions of Indians are pushed below the poverty line every single year by one medical event, not because the illness itself was rare, but because the cover was missing. The bad luck is shared by everyone. The protection, it turns out, is not. And here is the part that genuinely bothers me. We have quietly agreed to carry all of this risk personally and then to admire it as strength. The uninsured family that rebuilds after a flood is praised for its grit. The worker with no pension, who is still going at 60, is called disciplined. That grit is completely real, and I do not want to take it from anyone. But grit is mostly what you are forced to sell when the system hands you no cover. We have taken an absence of safety and dressed it up as a personality. Now, to be fair to the other side of this, none of it comes from carelessness. A family living close to the edge is not being reckless when it fails to save. When the income barely clears the expenses, there is simply nothing left over to become a buffer in the first place. You cannot store water in a bucket that is already empty by evening. The thin cushion, for most of India, is not a moral failure at all. It is an arithmetic one. And there is real progress worth naming here, honestly. More Indians hold a bank account today than at almost any point in our history. Government insurance and pension schemes now reach people who had absolutely nothing a decade ago. UPI put a serious financial tool into hundreds of millions of ordinary hands. This is not a country standing still. However, and it is a very large however, having access to an account is not at all the same as having a cushion sitting inside it. We build the pipes much faster than we manage to fill them. Which brings us to the big one, whether this is our fate or a thing we can actually fix. And here I want to be careful because the honest answer is that it is both slow and genuinely possible. A buffer is never built by a single scheme or a single video. It is built the way it is built anywhere. A little saved before it is spent, a little insured before it is ever needed, a little less borrowed for the things that do not last. Reframe it with me for a moment, though, because the problem is not that Indians do not save. Culturally, we are famous savers, in gold, in land, in the quiet, locked corners of the house. The real problem is that our savings sit in things you cannot reach at 2 in the morning on a bad night, while the shocks always arrive in cash. A buffer is not just money. It is money you can reach in time. We are not a nation without savings. We are a nation whose savings tend to arrive a full day too late. So here is what actually moves that number, and it is the boring set of things, which is exactly why nobody is trying to sell them to you. A small emergency fund kept somewhere dull and instantly reachable, sitting there before any clever investment. Real health cover for the whole family, because the most common shock of all is a medical one. And a quiet habit most of us skip entirely, knowing your own number, that days of survival figure from earlier, and slowly watching it climb. None of this is exotic. All of it is already quietly saving somebody, somewhere this very month. And here I will say the hopeful part plainly, because I genuinely believe it. A thin buffer is thin, but it is not absent. It is one of the very few problems on this channel that a single household can actually push back on by itself without waiting for a policy or a minister or a better year. Not easily, and not quickly, but really. The same ingenuity that already survives with no cushion can, pointed just slightly differently, begin to build one. Which brings me back to that kitchen table and the 15,000 rupee bill that quietly rearranged a whole month. I have thought about that night a great deal since. The bill itself was never really the problem. The problem was that one small, ordinary shock had a clear and open path straight to the center of a family's life, because nothing at all was standing in between. That empty space between the shock and the family is the entire subject of everything we are going to make after this. We have spent this video learning to see it. A cushion so thin that a Tuesday has to be financed, a page of headlines that are secretly one headline, and a country that took the absence of safety and quietly turned it into a virtue. The floods, the insurance gap, the jobs, the debt, all of it is just this same thin space looked at from a slightly different angle. They say a rainy day fund is meant for a rainy day. But we happen to live in a country of rivers and monsoons, of sudden bills and sudden layoffs, where the rain is not really the exception, it is the season. The least we can do is stop being surprised by it and start, however slowly, to build the small quiet thing that stands between the rain and the table.